Welcome, dear listener. Tonight's story unfolds quietly, without haste. If you fall asleep, the mystery will continue beside you. This is Hercule Mysteries, and this is the case of the silent witness. Chapter 1, The Unspoken Crime. There are crimes that announce themselves. They arrive with raised voices, broken glass, hurried footsteps, and the unmistakable urgency of disorder. They demand attention. They insist on being noticed. And then there are crimes that do not speak at all. They sit quietly in familiar rooms. They leave furniture untouched. They disturb nothing except the air. Hercule Poirot had learned over many years that it was these silent crimes that required the most careful listening. The night settled gently over Harrington Row, a modest street where the houses stood close enough to hear one another breathe. Lamps glowed behind drawn curtains. Windows reflected the soft amber light of the street lamps, rather than revealing what lay within. Number 12 appeared no different from its neighbors. Its door was closed, its windows were dark, its silence was complete. Inside, the clock chimed. Chime. The sound carried clearly through the narrow hallway, touching each room in turn before fading into stillness. The house accepted the sound without resistance, as it had done every night for decades. In the sitting room, Inspector Mallory stood near the fireplace, hat resting in his hands. He had been waiting for nearly an hour, careful not to disturb the room more than necessary. Even so, he felt as though the space watched him quietly, noting every movement. "This is where it happened," he said at last, unable to tolerate the silence any longer. Poirot, seated comfortably in an armchair, did not look up. "Yes," Poirot replied, "and also where it did not." Mallory frowned. "I beg your pardon?" Poirot lifted his gaze slowly and smiled faintly. "You see, Inspector," Poirot said, "a crime is not only defined by what occurs, it is also defined by what fails to occur." Mallory shifted his weight uncomfortably. The room itself was unremarkable. A sofa, 2 chairs, a low table, a lamp casting a warm circle of light. Everything was in its place. Too much in its place, perhaps. "No signs of struggle," Mallory said, repeating the phrase he had already written in his notebook. "No forced entry, no weapon." Poirot nodded. "And no witness who speaks." The witness sat near the window. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb was a woman of quiet presence. She sat upright in a straight-backed chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture composed. Her eyes were open, attentive and clear. She had been like this since the police arrived. She had not spoken a word. Mallory cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitcomb has been here all evening. She was present when her husband collapsed." Poirot glanced toward her. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "good evening." Mrs. Whitcomb did not respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the curtain, as though listening to something beyond the glass. Mallory lowered his voice. "Shock, we believe." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps something else." Mallory sighed. "Doctor says heart failure." Poirot nodded. "The doctor speaks of the body," he said. "I am more interested in the room." He rose slowly and began to walk. Poirot did not walk like a man in a hurry. He moved with deliberate care, allowing his footsteps to sound naturally against the wooden floor. The room responded with faint creaks, honest noises of age and use. Poirot stopped near the rug. "This rug," he said softly. Mallory glanced down. "What about it?" Poirot crouched slightly, examining the fibers. "It has been disturbed," Poirot said, "but only once." Mallory frowned. "Someone walked across it." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but not often, not hurriedly." He stood again and crossed to the small table near the sofa. A teacup rested there, half full, untouched. Poirot lifted it gently. "The tea is cold," Poirot said. Mallory nodded. "He never finished it." Poirot smiled faintly. "He never began to finish it." The clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot paused beneath it. "Did this clock chime earlier than usual?" Poirot asked. Mallory checked his notes. "Yes, about 5 minutes early." Poirot nodded. "A small thing," Poirot said. "But small things are often loud when listened to correctly." Mallory rubbed his temples. "With respect, Monsieur Poirot, we have a dead man and a silent witness. I'm not sure what you expect to hear." Poirot looked toward Mrs. Whitcomb again. "I do not expect her to speak," Poirot said gently. I expect the room to do it for her." Poirot approached the window. The curtains were drawn, but not fully. A narrow gap allowed a sliver of streetlight to fall across the floor. Outside, the street was quiet. A passerby walked slowly past, footsteps fading quickly into the distance. Poirot listened. He turned back to Mrs. Whitcomb. "Madame," Poirot said softly, "were you seated here all evening?" She did not respond. Mallory shifted impatiently. "She hasn't answered anything." Poirot raised a hand. "That is all right," he said. "She answers in other ways." Poirot stepped closer to her chair. He noticed the placement of her feet. Perfectly aligned, not tense, not relaxed, waiting. Poirot felt a familiar tightening in his chest. "This," he thought, "is not shock." He spoke again, his voice calm and unthreatening. "Madame," he said, "the night is very quiet." Her eyes flickered, just slightly. Poirot saw it. Poirot straightened and turned to Mallory. "This is a case," Poirot said quietly, "where silence has been instructed." Mallory stared. "Instructed," Poirot nodded. "Some people," Poirot continued, "are taught that speaking creates danger, that stillness brings safety." Mallory glanced nervously at Mrs. Whitcomb. "You think she's frightened?" Poirot shook his head. "No," he said. "I think she is obedient." Poirot resumed his slow walk around the room. He paused at the doorway. The threshold was worn, but evenly so. No sign of pacing, no sign of agitation. The hallway beyond was narrow and quiet. Poirot listened. "The house," he said softly, "is very good at holding sound." Mallory frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Poirot said, "that footsteps would travel clearly here." Mallory nodded. "Yes, you can hear someone approaching from the front door." Poirot smiled faintly. "And yet," he said, "no one heard anything." Mallory hesitated. "That's true." Poirot turned back to Mrs. Whitcomb. "You heard something," Poirot said gently. Her fingers tightened briefly against her skirt. Poirot waited. She did not speak, but she had heard. Later that night, Poirot stood alone in the sitting room. Mallory had stepped outside to make arrangements. The body had been removed. The house felt lighter, but not relieved. Poirot sat again in the armchair and listened. The clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot closed his eyes. This was not a crime of violence. It was a crime of timing. A chime too early, a silence too complete, a witness who had been trained not to answer. Poirot opened his eyes. "This," he murmured, "is only the beginning." Outside, the street lamp flickered softly. Inside, the silent witness waited. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of the house, the truth prepared itself to be heard, without ever speaking a word. Chapter 2. A witness who would not speak morning did not hurry into number 12. It arrived the way quiet truths often do, slowly, respectfully, without insisting on attention. Pale light crept along the edges of the curtains and rested there, as though unsure whether it was welcome inside. The house remained still, holding the night gently, rather than releasing it all at once. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb sat exactly where she had been the evening before. Her posture had not changed. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her gaze stayed fixed on the narrow space between the curtains and the window pane. Hercule Poirot observed this with careful interest. He had returned early, before the street fully woke, before routine could soften what the night had revealed. He believed that people and houses were most honest in the hours when they had not yet decided who they needed to be for the day. Inspector Mallory stood nearby, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "She hasn't moved," Mallory murmured. Poirot nodded. "Yes," Mallory shifted. "We offered tea. She declined. We suggested rest." Poirot glanced at Mrs. Whitcomb. "She is resting," Poirot said softly, "just not sleeping." The clock chimed the hour. Chime. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes flickered, only slightly, but Poirot noticed. Mallory did not. "You see?" Poirot murmured. Mallory frowned. "See what?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He watched Mrs. Whitcomb until her breathing settled again into its careful, measured rhythm. "She listens," Poirot said at last. Mallory sighed. "Everyone listens when a clock chimes." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but not everyone waits for it." Poirot approached Mrs. Whitcomb slowly, ensuring his footsteps were audible. He did not want to surprise her. Surprise was for interrogations. This was something else. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "you have been very brave." She did not look at him. Her fingers tightened slightly. Poirot waited. He had learned long ago that patience was not the absence of action, but a deliberate choice to allow space for something else to occur. "You were with your husband when he collapsed," Poirot continued softly. "That is not easy." Silence. Mallory cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitcomb, if you could just tell us—" Poirot raised a hand. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet." Mallory frowned but fell silent. Poirot shifted his chair and sat opposite Mrs. Whitcomb, positioning himself so that the lamplight did not fall directly on her face. He wanted her to remain comfortable, unobserved in the way she had learned to be. "You do not need to speak," Poirot said calmly. "Not yet." Her shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Poirot noticed. "This is important," he thought. Poirot stood and walked the room again. He examined the sitting room with renewed attention. In daylight, details emerged that night had softened. The rug fibers lay mostly undisturbed. The teacup still sat on the table. The chair beside the window bore a faint impression where someone had sat for a long time without shifting. Poirot paused at that chair. "This," he said softly, "is a listening chair." Mallory blinked. "A what?" Poirot gestured toward the window. "From here," Poirot explained, "one can hear the street clearly. Footsteps, carriages, voices." Mallory nodded. "Yes?" Poirot leaned slightly closer to the window. "And yet," he continued, "the curtains are never fully opened." Mallory frowned. "Privacy." Poirot smiled faintly. "No," he said, "control." Poirot turned his attention back to Mrs. Whitcomb. "Madame," he said, "you hear the world very well." Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. Poirot did not press. Instead, he spoke of something else. "Your husband," Poirot said, "kept a very regular routine." Her fingers tightened again. Poirot nodded to himself. "He liked order," Poirot continued. "Meals at the same hour, the same chair, the same newspaper folded the same way." Mrs. Whitcomb's gaze shifted at last, just briefly, to the empty chair near the fireplace. Poirot followed her glance. "Yes," he said softly, "that chair." Mallory leaned forward. "Monsieur Poirot, are you—" Poirot silenced him with a look. "He sat there every evening," Poirot continued, "until something interrupted the routine." Silence. Poirot waited. Mrs. Whitcomb's breathing changed, barely noticeable, but enough. Poirot leaned back. "Thank you," he said gently. Mallory stared at him. "For what?" "For listening," Poirot replied. Later that morning, Poirot requested privacy. Mallory protested, but reluctantly agreed to wait outside. Poirot believed this necessary. Authority created pressure, pressure created performance. And performance was precisely what he wished to avoid. Alone with Mrs. Whitcomb, Poirot lowered his voice. "You have been taught something," Poirot said softly. Her gaze remained forward. "You were taught," he continued, "that silence is safer than speech." Her hands trembled slightly. Poirot nodded. "Yes," he said. "I see." He spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully. "You were taught," he said, "that if you wait long enough, someone else will decide what happens next." A tear formed in the corner of her eye. Poirot did not rush to acknowledge it. "You are not in danger now," Poirot said, "but your body does not know that yet." Mrs. Whitcomb swallowed. Poirot continued gently. "May I ask you something?" he said. She hesitated. Then, barely perceptible, she nodded. Poirot smiled faintly. "When you heard your husband fall," Poirot asked, "what did you do first?" Her lips parted. No sound came out. Poirot waited. She tried again. Still nothing. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "That is all right," he said. "We will try a different way." He stood. Poirot walked to the hallway. He returned a moment later with the door slightly open. "Listen!" he said. The house responded. A distant door closing, footsteps outside, a radio playing faintly down the street. Poirot turned back to her. "You hear everything," he said, "but you were told not to respond." Her lips trembled. Poirot softened his tone even further. "You were told," he said, "that responding would make things worse." She nodded once. It was the first clear movement she had made since he arrived. Poirot felt a quiet certainty settle inside him. This was not merely a witness to a crime. This was a witness shaped by routine, trained to be still, taught that silence was obedience. A silent witness did not become silent by accident. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "you are not required to protect anyone anymore." Her breathing became uneven. Poirot waited. At last, a sound emerged. Not a word. A breath, sharp, unpracticed. Poirot nodded encouragingly. "That is enough for now," he said. She closed her eyes briefly, as though exhausted. Poirot stood. "We will stop," he said, "for today." Outside, Mallory paced impatiently. "Well?" he asked. Poirot met his gaze calmly. "She did not kill her husband," Poirot said. Mallory exhaled. "Good. But," Poirot continued, "she believes she must not explain why." Mallory frowned. "Why would she think that?" Poirot glanced back toward the house. "Because," he said, "someone taught her that silence would keep her safe." Mallory's brow furrowed. "You think someone else was here?" Poirot nodded. "Not last night," he said. "Not physically." Mallory stared. "Then how?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Instruction," he said. That evening, as dusk returned, Poirot remained in the sitting room. Mrs. Whitcomb had been persuaded to rest upstairs. She did not resist. She followed instruction easily. Another thing Poirot noted carefully. He sat beneath the clock and listened. Tick, tick, tick. The rhythm was steady. Too steady. Poirot reached up and rested his fingers lightly against the clock casing. "You have been part of this too," he murmured. The clock chimed. Chime. Poirot closed his eyes. This case would not be solved by force or confession. It would be solved by understanding who taught the witness to remain silent and why. Outside, night returned quietly. Inside, the house held its breath, and the silent witness waited, no longer alone, but not yet free. Chapter 3. The room that remembered everything. There are rooms that forget. They absorb voices, footsteps, laughter, and grief, then let them go, as though none of it ever happened. You can stand in such rooms and feel nothing at all, no matter what occurred there. And then there are rooms that remember everything, not dramatically, not loudly, but faithfully, through placement, through routine, through the small, stubborn order of objects that have never been allowed to move. Hercule Poirot believed the sitting room at number 12 remembered more than any person in it. That morning the sky outside was pale and uncertain, as though the sun itself had not yet decided how much of the day to reveal. Harrington Row was quiet. The street lamps were still on, glowing faintly in the thinning. Dark, while early footsteps passed with unhurried restraint. Inside the house, the air was warmer than the street, but not comforting. It felt held, preserved, as if the building had sealed itself around the events of the previous night and refused to let them fully disperse. Inspector Mallory arrived just after 8. He looked tired. His collar sat slightly wrong. His hat was held a little too tightly in his hands, and the notebook in his coat pocket was already thick with words that did not yet make sense. Poirot greeted him politely, as though welcoming a guest rather than an official. "Good morning, Inspector," Mallory sighed. "Morning? Any change?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the sitting-room door, which stood half open. Beyond it, lamplight still glowed softly, though morning had arrived. The light was unnecessary now, but Poirot understood why someone had left it on. Darkness, once associated with fear, did not surrender easily. "No change," Poirot said at last. "But we do not require change. We require accuracy." Mallory followed him into the sitting room. The room was as it had been the night before. The furniture remained in its polite arrangement. The rug lay centered and straight. The small table near the sofa held the same half-full teacup, now colder still. The fireplace was clean, unlit, and decorative rather than useful. The chair by the window was empty now. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb had been taken upstairs by a kind constable and placed in the guest bedroom, where she could rest under gentle supervision. She had not protested. She had followed instruction as easily as a person stepping into a familiar role. That ease, Poirot noted, was its own kind of evidence. Mallory looked around and exhaled. "It's too neat," he muttered. Poirot nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "Neatness is often the first disguise." Mallory frowned. "Disguise." Poirot stepped closer to the rug. "You see a tidy room," Poirot said. "I see a room that has been made tidy on purpose. Mallory rubbed his eyes. Or a man who liked order. Poirot smiled faintly. A man who liked order, he agreed. And perhaps also a man who demanded it. Poirot crouched and examined the rug again. He did not touch it at first. He simply observed the fibers, the direction they lay, the way the light skimmed across them. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a small handkerchief. With it, he brushed the rug gently, just enough to reveal where its surface had been pressed more firmly than the surrounding area. "There," Poirot said. Mallory bent closer. "What am I looking at?" Poirot pointed. "A heel impression." Mallory frowned. "Someone stood there." "Yes," Poirot said, "but they stood there still." Mallory stared. Poirot continued, his voice calm. "When a person moves in panic, the rug tells us. It twists, it bunches, it drags. When a person walks casually, the pressure is even. But this," he tapped lightly near the impression, "this is the mark of someone who stood and waited." Mallory straightened slowly, the implication sinking in. "You think someone else was here," Mallory said. Poirot rose and smoothed his jacket. "I think," he replied, "someone else has been here before." Poirot moved toward the fireplace. Above it hung a framed photograph, Mr. Whitcomb and his wife standing side by side, expressionless in the manner of formal portraits. Their posture suggested proximity without intimacy. Poirot studied it for a long moment. "What?" Mallory asked, impatient. Poirot did not look away. "In photographs," Poirot said softly, "people show us how they want to be seen and what they fear being seen as." Mallory frowned. "You can't solve a murder from a photograph." Poirot smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but we can learn who trained the room to behave." He turned away from the photograph and examined the mantelpiece. A few objects sat there, arranged with deliberate symmetry. A small clock, a decorative box, a candle holder. Nothing personal, nothing spontaneous. Poirot lifted the decorative box carefully. Inside were matches, unused. He replaced the box exactly as it had been. Mallory watched. "You're looking for something specific?" he asked. Poirot nodded. "Not something present," he said. "Something absent." Mallory blinked. "Absent?" Poirot walked to the side table near the sofa and picked up the teacup again. He sniffed it. "Black tea," Poirot murmured. "Strong." Mallory nodded. "So?" Poirot pointed toward the saucer. "No sugar bowl," he said. Mallory frowned. "Maybe he didn't take sugar." Poirot's eyes remained steady. "Perhaps," Poirot said. "But the tea was poured for an evening. There are 2 chairs in use. The cup was prepared as though expecting company." Mallory glanced around. There were only 2 of them. Poirot set the cup down gently. "Then why," Poirot asked quietly, "was the tea poured like a performance?" Mallory stared at him. Poirot continued. "Order can be habit," Poirot said, "but order can also be compliance." The clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot turned toward it. "That clock," he said softly, "was wrong last night." Mallory nodded. 5 minutes early. Poirot walked beneath it and listened. The ticking was steady, too even, too confident. "Clocks," Poirot said, "are like people. They reveal themselves in their inconsistencies." Mallory frowned. "And what does this one reveal?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He reached up and touched the clock casing gently. It was cool, smooth, well-maintained. Poirot's fingers lingered near the side panel. Then he withdrew them and looked at Mallory. "Inspector," Poirot said, "tell me the exact moment when Mr. Whitcomb collapsed." Mallory flipped through his notebook. "According to the neighbor who called it in," he said, "shortly after 9. Mrs. Whitcomb was seen at the window at 9:15. Ambulance arrived at 9:20. Poirot nodded slowly. "And the clock chimed at—" Mallory hesitated. "It chimed at 8:55. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Mallory blinked. "But—" "Yes," Poirot said gently, "it chimed early." Mallory stared at the clock as if seeing it for the first time. "You think someone adjusted it?" Mallory whispered. Poirot nodded. "But not to deceive the police," Poirot said. "To deceive the witness." Mallory looked unsettled now. "You mean she's responding to the clock?" he asked. Poirot's voice remained calm. "Some people," Poirot said, are trained to respond to cues. A chime, a signal, a particular hour. It tells them when to act, when to remain still, when to expect the next instruction. Mallory swallowed. That's strange, he said. Poirot smiled. Faintly. Strange, Poirot replied. Only if you believe control must always be loud. He turned back toward the window chair. This chair, Poirot said, is not only a place to sit, Mallory frowned. Then what is it? A station, Poirot said. A place of readiness. Poirot walked closer to the chair. The carpet beneath it had a darker impression than the surrounding area, not from one night's use, from many. She sat here often, Mallory said. Poirot nodded. And she sat here, Poirot added, the way one sits when waiting for something specific. Mallory asked quietly, Like what? Poirot looked toward the curtains. Like a signal, he said. Poirot asked for the curtains to be opened fully. A constable did so carefully. Sunlight spilled into the sitting room, brighter than expected. Dust danced in the beam. The sudden openness made the room feel less controlled, less intentional. Poirot stood by the window and looked out at the street. Across the way, 2 houses down, stood a narrow alley between buildings. It was the kind of passage most people never noticed, useful for deliveries, bins, and the occasional shortcut. Poirot narrowed his eyes. What? Mallory asked. Poirot pointed subtly. A place to stand, he said. A place to be unseen yet present. Mallory stared. You think someone watched the house? Poirot nodded. Not necessarily last night, he said, but often enough to create routine. Mallory's face tightened. He lowered his voice. You think someone has been controlling her, Mallory said. Poirot's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp. I think, Poirot said, she has been taught that silence is protection. Mallory glanced toward the stairs, where Mrs. Whitcomb rested upstairs. And you think her husband was part of it? Mallory asked. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked back into the room and stopped near Mr. Whitcomb's chair, the chair near the fireplace. It was upholstered in dark fabric, worn slightly at the arms where hands had rested repeatedly. Poirot placed his palm on the armrest. The fabric was smooth, too smooth. He leaned closer, then he straightened. This chair, Poirot said quietly, was not only for sitting. Mallory frowned. What else would it be? Poirot's voice lowered. For reminding, he said, for taking a position. Mallory stared. Poirot continued. A man who demands silence, Poirot said, often does so from the same place at the same time, with the same posture. He turns his demand into a ritual, and the ritual becomes law. Mallory swallowed. You think Mr. Whitcomb demanded her silence, he said. Poirot nodded gently. Yes, he said, but perhaps not alone. A soft knock came at the door. A constable entered carrying a small tray. Tea, the constable said quietly. And something else, sir. He handed Mallory a folded piece of paper. Mallory opened it and frowned. What is it? Poirot asked. Mallory held it out. A note, Mallory said, confused. Found in the bin out back. Poirot took it carefully. The paper was plain, the writing neat and controlled. Too controlled. Only 3 lines. Do not speak. Do not move until the chime. Wait! Mallory's face went pale. Poirot read it twice, then folded it slowly. This, Poirot said softly, is not written by a man in love with routine. Mallory's voice was tight. Then who wrote it? Poirot looked toward the window again. A person, Poirot said, who believes silence is something that can be owned. Mallory whispered. So the silent witness, Poirot nodded. Is not silent because she cannot speak, Poirot finished. She is silent because she was instructed to be. Poirot rose. He moved toward the hallway and stood beneath the clock again. He listened. Tick, tick, tick. Then he did. Something Mallory did not expect. He reached behind the clock casing and pressed lightly along the side panel. A faint click, a hidden latch. Mallory stepped closer. What? Poirot opened the small panel. Inside was a simple mechanism, nothing elaborate but clearly added. A manual adjustment lever, allowing the clock to be shifted forward or backward in small increments. Mallory stared. So someone did adjust it, he whispered. Poirot nodded. Not to change time, Poirot said. To change obedience. Mallory looked sick. This is calculated, he said. Poirot closed the panel carefully. Yes, Poirot replied. And calculation requires practice. He returned to the sitting room and sat. Mallory remained standing. So what now? Mallory asked quietly. Poirot's voice was gentle. Now, he said, we find out who taught this house to remember silence. Mallory frowned. How? Poirot looked toward the stairs again, where Mrs. Whitcomb rested. We do not force her to speak, Poirot said. We remove what frightens her into silence. Mallory nodded slowly, as though the idea was both humane and terrifying. Poirot reached for his teacup and took a small sip. Then he added softly, and we listen for the sound that arrives after the chime. The clock ticked on, steady and patient. Outside, the street grew louder as day continued. Inside, the room remembered everything, waiting, as it always had, for the next instruction. Chapter 4, Footsteps Without Voices. There are footsteps that belong to people. They arrive with weight and hesitation. They shift when the mind changes. They hurry when fear rises and slow when confidence fades. And then there are footsteps that no longer belong to anyone at all. They are repetitions. They are rehearsals. They are sounds that have been practiced until intention has disappeared. Hercule Poirot listened for the second kind. That evening, number 12 settled into itself once more. The sitting-room lamps were lit softly, not because darkness frightened anyone, but because habit insisted upon it. The rug lay centered and straight. The chairs remained where they had always been. The clock resumed its gentle authority at the end of the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Inspector Mallory sat stiffly in one of the armchairs, his notebook closed for once. He had written enough for the day. Words, he had discovered, did not always help when sound itself seemed to hold meaning. You really think someone will come back? Mallory asked quietly. Poirot did not answer at once. He sat beneath the clock, hands folded neatly, eyes half closed. Not asleep, but listening with the focus of a musician waiting for the wrong note. I think, Poirot said at last, that someone will be unable to resist confirming that the house still obeys. Mallory frowned. That's a strange way to put it. Poirot smiled faintly. Obedience, Poirot said, is addictive. Mrs. Whitcomb remained upstairs. Poirot had insisted on this, not as confinement but as separation. The sitting room, he believed, needed to behave as it had before the crime, to invite whatever pattern had been established to repeat itself. Mallory glanced toward the hallway. You expect footsteps, Mallory said. Poirot nodded. Yes, Mallory shifted, but whose? Poirot opened his eyes. That, he said gently, is the question the footsteps will answer. The hour crept forward. Outside, the street quieted, shops closed, radios dimmed. The occasional carriage passed, its sound fading quickly into distance. Inside the house, everything remained unnaturally consistent. The clock chimed. Chime. Mallory stiffened. Nothing followed. Poirot did not move. The seconds passed. Then, a sound. Not loud, not sudden. A footstep. It came from the hallway. Mallory's breath caught. Did you? Poirot raised one finger. The step sounded again, measured, controlled. Even. It moved forward one pace, then another. Poirot listened intently. These, he murmured, are not uncertain footsteps, Mallory whispered. Someone's inside the house. Poirot shook his head slowly. No, he said. Someone's routine is. The footsteps reached the edge of the sitting room. They paused. Poirot opened his eyes. Observe, he whispered. The sound did not approach further. It did not retreat. It waited. Mallory's knuckles whitened around his chair arms. This is impossible, Mallory whispered. No one came in. Poirot's voice remained calm. Not tonight, he said. The footsteps turned. They moved back down the hallway at the same measured pace. One step, then another, then silence. Mallory stared at Poirot. What in God's name was that? Poirot leaned back. That, he said softly, was a rehearsal. Mallory stood abruptly. We should search the house, he said. Poirot raised a hand. No, he said gently. We should listen again. Mallory hesitated. Monsieur Poirot, Poirot's gaze was steady. If you interrupt a performance, Poirot said, you never learn who taught it. Mallory sank back into his chair, shaken. the house returned to quiet. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot closed his eyes once more. Minutes passed. The clock chimed again. This time, the quarter hour. Nothing happened. Mallory exhaled shakily. Poirot opened his eyes. "You see," Poirot said, "the footsteps did not come at random." Mallory swallowed. "They came after the chime." "Yes," Poirot nodded. "Always after the chime." Mallory frowned. "But who—" Poirot raised his hand. "Someone," he said, "who believed sound could replace presence." Poirot stood. He walked deliberately into the hallway, ensuring his own footsteps were audible and uneven. The floor responded honestly, creaking under his weight. He stopped at the place where the footsteps had paused. Poirot looked down. There was no mark on the rug, no sign of pressure. "This," Poirot said softly, "is very important." Mallory joined him. "There's nothing here?" Poirot nodded. "Exactly," he said. "Nothing was physically here." Mallory stared at him. "Then what were we hearing?" Poirot smiled faintly. "A memory," he said, "repeated until it forgot who made it." Poirot turned toward the staircase. "The footsteps," he said, "did not climb the stairs." Mallory nodded slowly. "They stopped short." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Why stop here?" Poirot asked. Mallory frowned. "Because the sitting room is where—" Poirot nodded. "Where authority lived," he finished softly. They returned to their seats. Mallory's voice was quiet now. "You think the footsteps belong to Mr. Whitcomb?" Poirot considered. "Once," he said, "but not any more." Mallory's brow furrowed. "I don't understand." Poirot folded his hands. "A man who demands silence," Poirot said, "often walks the same path each night. His footsteps become predictable. His presence becomes routine." Mallory listened. "And the person who lives with him," Poirot continued, "learns to hear those footsteps not as movement but as instruction." Mallory swallowed. "So even after he's gone," Poirot nodded. "The body stops," Poirot said. "The pattern does not." They sat in silence until the next hour. The clock chimed. Chime. Nothing followed this time. Poirot opened his eyes. "That is new," he murmured. Mallory whispered, "What does it mean?" Poirot smiled faintly. "It means," he said, "that the pattern is weakening." Mallory exhaled slowly. Later that night, Poirot asked Mallory to leave. "You have heard enough for tonight," Poirot said kindly. Mallory hesitated, then nodded. "You'll stay?" Mallory asked. "Yes," Poirot said. "I want the house to believe it is alone." Mallory departed quietly. Poirot remained beneath the clock. Tick, tick, tick. The house listened back. Near midnight, something changed. The air shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly. Poirot felt it the way one feels a change in pressure before a storm. The clock chimed. Chime. Poirot waited. The footsteps returned. This time they were different. Slower, less certain, they moved only 2 steps before stopping. Poirot spoke softly into the hallway. "You may stop now," he said. The footsteps froze. Poirot continued. "You do not need to repeat this," he said gently. "No one is listening anymore." Silence stretched, then nothing. No retreat, no advance. Just absence. Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he murmured. "Good." The footsteps did not return. The house settled into a deeper quiet than before, one that felt less controlled, less instructed. Poirot rose and walked once more through the hallway. His footsteps sounded alone now, unanswered. He reached the sittings room and extinguished one lamp, then another. Darkness fell gently, without command. Upstairs, Mrs. Whitcomb slept. Her breathing was uneven but natural. She dreamed, not of clocks or footsteps, but of open spaces where sound came and went without consequence. Poirot paused at the foot of the stairs and listened one final time. Nothing answered him. "That," he said softly, "is progress." As dawn approached, Poirot sat once more beneath the clock. Tick, tick, tick. He reached up and adjusted it, not to correct its time, but to loosen its authority, just slightly. Enough. The house would learn again how to be ordinary. Outside, the first morning birds began their uncertain songs. Inside, the footsteps were gone, and with them the illusion that silence could command obedience. Chapter 5. The long pause before midnight. Some pauses are ordinary. A pause between sentences, a pause before a door opens, a pause while a kettle reaches its boil. But there is a kind of pause that feels different. It is not empty, it is not restful, it is deliberate. It is the long pause before midnight, when a house seems to stop doing what houses normally do and begins to wait for something else. Hercule Poirot felt that pause settle over number 12 as the evening moved toward its darkest hour. The sitting room was lit softly. The lamps were not bright. They did not chase the shadows away, only made them gentle. The furniture stood in its precise arrangement, as if unsure whether it was permitted to shift. The rug remained centered, almost too perfect to be trusted. And the clock, always the clock, waited at the end of the hallway with the quiet confidence of a thing that believed it could still command a room. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot sat beneath it, hands folded, his gaze drifting occasionally toward the sitting-room door, then back again. Not because he expected someone to enter, but because he wanted to sense the moment when the house itself changed. Inspector? Mallory arrived shortly after 9, bringing with him the sharp smell of cold night air and the restless energy of a man who did not like being asked to do nothing. "She's still upstairs," Mallory said quietly, hanging his coat. Poirot nodded. "Yes." Mallory lowered his voice. "No words?" Poirot's expression remained gentle. "Not yet." Mallory sighed. "We can't hold a case on silence." Poirot looked at him calmly. "You can hold a case on anything that repeats itself." They sat together in the sitting room with cups of tea that neither man drank quickly. Mallory had tried to fill the quiet once or twice, with theories, with medical details, with talk of paperwork and procedure, but Poirot had allowed each attempt to fade naturally, as though the room did not approve of too much speech. "This house," Mallory muttered at last, "feels like it's listening." Poirot smiled faintly. "It is." Mallory frowned. "To what?" Poirot's gaze moved toward the hallway. "To timing," Poirot said. Mallory followed his look and swallowed. "The clock again." Poirot nodded. Mallory tapped his fingers against the armrest, then forced himself to stop. "All right. Explain something to me. If the witness won't speak and the victim is dead, who are we listening for?" Poirot paused before answering, as if choosing the gentlest truth. "We are listening," Poirot said softly, "for the person who taught her silence." Mallory's mouth tightened. "You think someone's controlling her?" Poirot shook his head slightly. "Not now," he corrected. "Not actively, but control, Inspector, is not always a hand on the shoulder. Sometimes it is a clock on the wall." The night deepened. Outside Harrington Row quieted. The street lamp glow became softer, almost sleepy. The occasional passer-by moved without haste. The city beyond the street receded into a distant hush. Inside the house, the long pause began to take shape. Poirot noticed it first in the air. It became heavier, as though the rooms were holding their breath. Small sounds, such as the shifting of fabric, the settling of wood, seemed to occur less often. It was not that the house grew quieter. It was that it grew expectant. Mallory felt it too, though he did not know how to describe it. He simply sat straighter without realizing it, as if his body had decided something important was approaching. Poirot watched him kindly. "You feel it," Poirot said. Mallory whispered, "Midnight?" Poirot nodded. "Not midnight itself," Poirot corrected gently, "but the belief that midnight is a signal." Mallory exhaled. "So what do we do?" Poirot's voice was calm. "We do nothing. We let the house show us what it has been taught." At 10:30, Poirot stood. He walked into the hallway and turned the light on. Mallory blinked. "Why?" Poirot glanced back at him. "Darkness," Poirot said, "is a collaborator. It exaggerates." Mallory nodded slowly and followed. Poirot stood beneath the clock. The tick was steady again, almost too steady, like a person trying to sound calm while hiding excitement. Poirot listened with his head slightly tilted. Then he reached for the side panel, where he had found the hidden latch, and opened it quietly. The manual lever rested inside like a secret. Mallory's throat tightened. "So anyone could—" Poirot nodded. "Yes," Mallory frowned. "Then how do we know who did?" Poirot closed the panel again. "We do not know yet," Poirot said, "but we know what kind of mind would do it." Mallory asked quietly. What kind? Poirot looked down the hallway, as if seeing a person there even in emptiness. A mind that requires the world to obey, Poirot said. A mind that cannot tolerate spontaneous sound, Mallory swallowed. Like someone who hates being surprised, Poirot smiled faintly. Exactly. Back in the sitting room, Poirot moved the teacup from the side table to the mantelpiece. Mallory frowned. Why move it? Poirot's tone remained mild. Because I want to see if the room corrects itself. Mallory stared. The room? Poirot nodded. If someone has trained this house into ritual, then ritual will insist on being restored. Mallory looked unsettled. This is becoming uncomfortable, Poirot finished gently. Yes, that is how truth often feels before it becomes obvious. They waited. Nothing moved. The teacup remained on the mantelpiece. Poirot nodded to himself. Not the house, then, he murmured. Not tonight. Mallory leaned forward. What does that mean? Poirot took a small sip of tea at last. It means, he said, the correction comes from a person, not a place. At 11:15, a soft sound came from upstairs. Mallory's head lifted instantly. A creak, a footstep. Poirot stood at once, not hurried but attentive. They moved quietly to the base of the stairs. Poirot called gently, Madame Whitcomb? No answer. Another step sounded above, slow, careful, as though the person making it was uncertain whether they were allowed to move. Poirot's voice softened further. Madame, it is all right. Silence. Poirot waited. Then, very softly, the upstairs door opened. A faint shape appeared at the top of the stairs. Mrs. Whitcomb, standing in the dimness, her hair loose now, her expression composed but tired. She looked down at them. Her gaze drifted immediately to the hallway clock. Poirot noticed the movement with the satisfaction of someone seeing a locked door finally reveal its keyhole. Madame, Poirot said gently, would you like some tea? She did not answer, but she took one slow step forward, then another. She began to descend. Mallory held his breath. Poirot remained calm, his posture open, his presence non-threatening. Mrs. Whitcomb reached the bottom step and stopped. Her hands were clasped tightly now, knuckles pale. Poirot spoke softly. You came downstairs because you felt you should, he said, not because you wanted to. Her lips parted. No words came. Poirot nodded gently. That is all right. He glanced toward the clock. It is almost time, Poirot said quietly. Mrs. Whitcomb's shoulders tightened. Mallory whispered, Time for what? Poirot did not answer. The minute hand climbed. The air thickened. The long pause became almost tangible. Mrs. Whitcomb stood near the sitting-room doorway, not entering, not leaving, hovering at the boundary like a person waiting for permission to exist. Poirot watched her with great care. Madame, he said softly, what happens when the clock chimes? Her eyes flickered. Poirot continued. Do you stand? He asked. Do you sit? Do you wait? Her lips trembled. Then, so faint that Mallory almost missed it, a sound emerged. Not a word, a breath that caught halfway, as if her body had attempted speech and been stopped. Poirot nodded. Yes, he murmured. We are close. Mallory's face was tight. Close to what? Poirot's voice was gentle. Close to the first crack in obedience. At 11:59, the house held still. Even the ticking seemed louder. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot watched Mrs. Whitcomb. Her gaze was fixed on the clock face with the devotion of someone waiting for instruction. Poirot stepped slightly closer, not invading, simply present. You are safe, he said softly. Her jaw clenched. The clock chimed. Chime. Mrs. Whitcomb flinched, not dramatically, not like a frightened person, like a trained person who has been called. Poirot spoke immediately, calm and steady. No, he said gently, not tonight. Mrs. Whitcomb froze. Mallory stared at Poirot. What are you doing? Poirot did not look away from her. I am interrupting the ritual, Poirot said softly. I am giving her another cue. Mrs. Whitcomb's breathing became uneven. Poirot's voice remained low and kind. Madame, he said, you do not have to obey the chime. Her lips moved. A whisper tried to form. Nothing came. Poirot waited. Then he added very quietly, If you do not obey it, nothing terrible will happen. The silence stretched. Mallory felt it too. This silence was different from the others. It was not empty. It was decision. Mrs. Whitcomb's fingers loosened just slightly from their tight clasp. Poirot saw it and continued. "Look at me," he said. She hesitated. Then her eyes shifted from the clock to Poirot's face. Her gaze was startled, almost guilty, as though looking away from the clock were a betrayal. Poirot offered her the smallest smile. "That is good," he said. "Very good." A faint sound came from the hallway. Mallory stiffened. Poirot did not move. It was not the rehearsed footsteps they had heard the night before. It was softer, more human. A shuffle, perhaps, like a person adjusting weight while standing still. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Someone was near, not inside the house yet, but close enough for the house to feel watched. Mallory whispered, "Did you hear that?" Poirot nodded once. "Yes," he said softly. "The teacher is listening." Mrs. Whitcomb's face drained of color. Poirot held his gaze on her, calm and steady. "You hear it too," Poirot murmured to her. "But you will not respond." Her lips trembled. Poirot continued, voice firm but gentle. "This house does not belong to the chime," he said. "And you do not belong to it either." The shuffling sound in the hallway stopped. Then, faintly from outside, came the quietest sound of all, a step on the pavement. Mallory's eyes widened. Poirot remained still. The step did not repeat. It lingered as absence. Then it moved away. One step, then another, retreating slowly, as if whoever listened had decided not to enter. Poirot exhaled softly. "Yes," he murmured. "You see, he is careful. He prefers control." Mallory whispered, "Who is he?" Poirot's eyes stayed on Mrs. Whitcomb. "That," Poirot said quietly, "will come next." Mrs. Whitcomb's breathing slowed gradually. She remained looking at Poirot now, not the clock. Poirot spoke gently. "Madam," he said, "you did something very brave." Her lips parted, and at last, like a door opening only a fraction, sound emerged, a single word, hoarse, barely formed. "Wait!" Poirot nodded slowly, as if he had expected it. "Yes," he whispered. "They told you to wait." Mrs. Whitcomb swallowed hard. Then a second word, quiet, frightened, but present. "Always." Mallory felt his chest tighten. Poirot's face softened. "You waited," Poirot said gently, "because waiting felt safe." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes filled with tears. Poirot did not press for more. "Tonight," he said softly, "you do not wait any more." She closed her eyes. Tears slid down her cheek. Poirot let the silence hold her gently, not as command, but as rest. When Mrs. Whitcomb finally turned and walked slowly back toward the stairs, she did so without looking at the clock. That small detail, Poirot knew, mattered more than any confession. Mallory watched her go, shaken. "She spoke," Mallory whispered. Poirot nodded. "Only 2 words," Mallory said. Poirot smiled faintly. "2 words," he said, "are enough to show us a whole structure." Mallory stared at the clock. "And now?" Poirot's gaze drifted toward the front door. "Now," he said softly, "we follow the long pause to the person who created it." The clock continued to tick, 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 but it sounded different now, less like a command, more like time. And for the first time since the night of the unspoken crime, the house felt as though it had begun to exhale. Chapter 6. The man who listened too closely. There are people who hear sounds, and then there are people who wait for them. They do not hear a clock tick and move on. They listen to the space between ticks. They do not notice footsteps as passing noise. They measure their distance, their weight, their intention. Hercule Poirot had met many such people. They were rarely loud. They were rarely impatient. And they were almost never careless. The man who had taught Eleanor Whitcomb to wait belonged to this category. Morning arrived with a gentleness that felt almost apologetic. Poirot stood at the front window of number 12, watching Harrington Row come awake. A baker's cart rattled past. A woman opened her door to collect milk bottles, their glass chiming softly as she set them down. Somewhere nearby, a wireless crackled into life, and then settled into a calm morning voice. The city, Poirot observed, was excellent at disguising control as routine. Inspector Mallory joined him, still shaken from the night before. "She spoke," Mallory said again, as though repeating it might make the fact solid. "Only 2 words," Poirot replied calmly. "But she spoke," Mallory insisted. Poirot turned from the window. "Yes," he said, "which means the grip has loosened." Mallory frowned. "But the man behind it, whoever he is, he was listening last night. You're certain?" Poirot nodded. A man who trains silence, Poirot said, cannot resist checking whether it still obeys. Poirot asked to see the alley again. Mallory led him outside, down Harrington Row, and toward the narrow passage between two buildings across from number 12. In daylight it looked unremarkable. Bare brick walls, a few discarded crates, the faint smell of damp stone. Poirot stopped halfway down the alley. "Here," he said softly. Mallory looked around. "What makes you so sure?" Poirot gestured toward the ground. "The acoustics," he said. "Sound travels cleanly from here. A person standing still could hear the chime, the footsteps, even the pause." Mallory swallowed. "So he stood here, night after night." Poirot nodded. "Listening," Poirot said. "Correcting, adjusting." Mallory's jaw tightened. "You think he adjusted the clock himself?" "Yes," Poirot replied. "But not every night. Only when the pattern threatened to drift." Mallory exhaled. "That's obsession." Poirot smiled faintly. "No, obsession is emotional. This is method." Later that afternoon, Poirot asked to review old reports. Not crime reports, noise complaints. Mallory was puzzled but complied. They sat at a desk in the small police office nearby, stacks of yellowed papers between them. Poirot read slowly, carefully, as though listening rather than reading. Then he stopped. "This one," Poirot said. Mallory leaned closer. "Noise complaint." Poirot nodded. "From a resident 3 houses down. Reported a man standing in the alley late at night, doing nothing." Mallory frowned. "That's not illegal." Poirot smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but it is revealing." Mallory read on. "Same description appears again, twice more, months apart." Poirot nodded. "Spacing," he said. He did not want to be noticed. Mallory hesitated. "Name?" Poirot turned the page. "Julian Caro," he said quietly. Mallory frowned. "Never heard of him?" Poirot nodded. "Of course not. He does not want to be heard." Julian Caro lived alone. His flat was small, orderly, and almost entirely devoid of personal decoration. There were no photographs, no letters, no visible signs of emotional attachment. Only objects, precise ones. A clock on the wall, set exactly. A metronome on a shelf. A notebook filled with neat columns of time markings. Poirot observed all of this without touching anything. Mallory shifted uncomfortably. "He's not here." Poirot nodded. "No, he avoids being present when he is expected." Poirot crossed to the window. It overlooked Harrington Row. Number 12 was visible in the distance. Poirot smiled faintly. "He likes proximity," Poirot murmured. "But not intrusion," Mallory whispered. "You think he trained her?" Poirot nodded. "He trained her," Poirot said, "the way one trains an instrument." Poirot found the radio last. It was not remarkable at first glance. An ordinary wireless set sat on a small table, its casing well cared for. But Poirot noticed the subtle modifications immediately, the fine-tuning dial, the altered wiring, the carefully insulated interior. "This radio," Poirot said softly, "does not broadcast." Mallory frowned. "Then what does it do?" Poirot turned it on. A low hum filled the room, not static, a signal. Poirot adjusted the dial slightly. A click followed. Then silence. Mallory felt his skin prickle. "Is that—" Poirot nodded. "A cue," Mallory whispered. "He was signaling her." Poirot nodded again. "Yes," he said. "Not with words, with permission." That night, Poirot returned to number 12 alone. Mallory protested, but Poirot insisted. "If he comes," Poirot said gently, "he must believe the house is unguarded." The lamps were left exactly as they had been. The rug remained removed. The clock ticked, still imperfect. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot sat beneath it, listening. Midnight approached. The house did not tighten this time. It waited, but without certainty. Poirot felt the difference immediately. At 11:58, a sound came from outside. A footstep. Poirot didn't move. Another step, closer. Then the faintest scrape. The sound of someone standing still, adjusting position carefully. Poirot spoke softly into the room. "You are early," he said. Silence. Poirot continued calmly. "You prefer to arrive after the chime." he said. "But you were unsure tonight." The silence shifted. Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he murmured, "you are losing confidence." A shape appeared briefly in the frosted glass of the front door. Poirot remained seated. "You no longer control her," Poirot said softly. "That frightens you." The handle did not turn. Poirot continued. "You taught her to wait," he said, "but you never taught yourself how to stop listening." The shadow moved, a single step backward, then another. Poirot closed his eyes. "Good," he whispered. "That will do." The footsteps retreated. The night settled. The clock chimed. Chime. Nothing followed. Poirot remained seated for a long time afterward. He knew now the man who listened too closely could not bear disorder, and once his control was threatened, he would reveal himself again, either to reclaim it or to prove it still existed. Either way, Poirot would be listening. Chapter 7. Where Silence Was Learned. There are places that teach people how to behave. Not with signs, not with rules posted on walls, but with atmosphere. They shape movement by discouraging it. They train voices by absorbing them. They teach silence not as absence, but as expectation. Hercule Poirot believed that if Eleanor Whitcomb had learned to wait, then somewhere there existed a place designed to reward waiting. And such places, Poirot knew, always revealed themselves eventually. Julian Carew did not return to his flat the next day. Poirot had expected this. Men who relied on control rarely returned to places once they suspected observation. They preferred to hover at the edge of their own lives, listening from a distance until they were certain the rhythm had settled again. But Carew had made a mistake. He had created too many points of silence. Poirot stood once more in the alley opposite number 12, his hands clasped behind his back, listening to the morning sounds bounce off brick and stone. The acoustics here were not accidental. They were useful. A sound made in the sitting room, especially the chime, would travel cleanly. Footsteps in the hallway would arrive softened but distinct. A pause would be unmistakable. This was not enough for him, Poirot murmured. Inspector Mallory, standing nearby, frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot gestured faintly down the alley. "He did not only listen from here," Poirot said. "This was for confirmation, for reassurance." Mallory frowned. "Then where did he teach her?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Where sound disappears," he said. They found it 2 streets away, an old rehearsal building, once used for radio, plays, voice training, and small performances, stood quietly between newer structures that had long since outgrown it. Its brick facade was clean but uninviting. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass clouded with age. No sign announced its purpose. That, Poirot noted, was the point. "This place," Mallory said quietly, "was closed years ago." Poirot nodded. "And yet it remains." They entered through a side door that yielded without resistance. Inside, the air changed immediately. Sound did not echo here. Settled, Poirot took one careful step forward. His footfall landed without protest, swallowed almost instantly by the floor. Mallory whispered, "That's unsettling." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. "It is perfect." The corridor stretched long and straight, lined with heavy doors on either side. Each door bore a faint number, painted, then repainted, then almost erased. The lighting was soft, indirect, deliberately kind to shadows. Poirot paused. He closed his eyes. He listened. Nothing responded. "This," Poirot said quietly, "is where silence is rewarded." Mallory swallowed. "You think she was brought here?" Poirot nodded. "Not at first," Poirot said. "First, she was invited." They moved slowly. Poirot stopped before one door in particular. It was no different from the others. Same paint, same handle, same faint marking, but the air here felt slightly denser, as though it had been used recently. Poirot placed his hand gently on the door. No vibration, no echo. "This one," he said. Inside, the room was simple, too simple. The walls were lined with thick acoustic panels. The floor was padded. The ceiling hung lower than expected, creating an intimacy that discouraged standing tall. At the center of the room stood a single wooden chair beneath a hanging lamp. No table, no decoration, no distraction. Mallory felt a chill. "This is a lesson," Poirot finished softly. He walked slowly around the chair. The floor bore faint impressions. Scuffs where feet had been placed carefully, not pacing, not panic, waiting. Poirot closed his eyes again. He imagined Eleanor Whitcomb sitting here, not restrained, not threatened, but instructed. "Sit," a calm voice would have said. "Listen. Do not move until you are told." Mallory whispered, "This is where he taught her." Poirot nodded. "And, more importantly," Poirot said, "this is where she learned that silence earned approval." They found the metronome on a shelf near the door. It was old, well-maintained, its weight set carefully. Poirot wound it gently. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound filled the room evenly. Mallory's chest tightened. "That's timing," Poirot said. "Predictability." Poirot stopped the metronome. Silence rushed back, not abruptly, but smoothly. "This room," Poirot said, "does not frighten. It conditions." Mallory clenched his fists. "That man," Poirot raised a hand. "He believed he was helping," Poirot said gently. "That is the most dangerous kind." They found evidence without drama. A notebook, carefully hidden, pages filled with time entries rather than words. A schedule, not of dates but of intervals. A radio transmitter, small, precise, designed only to signal, not to speak, to cue. Mallory stared at the pages. "He reduced her to timing." Poirot nodded. "He reduced himself as well," Poirot said. "That is the irony." That evening, Poirot returned to number 12, not to wait, to change something. He stood in the hallway beneath the clock and removed it from the wall. Mallory blinked. "You're taking it down?" Poirot nodded. "For now," he said. "Its authority must be interrupted." The wall looked strange without it, bare, uncertain. Poirot placed the clock on a table in the sitting room, its ticking still audible but no longer commanding the house. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded smaller now. Mrs. Whitcomb descended the stairs slowly. She paused when she noticed the absence. Her eyes moved to the table. Poirot watched her carefully. "You may ignore it," Poirot said gently, "or you may listen, but it no longer tells you what to do." She hesitated, then she nodded. Later that night, Poirot waited in the sitting room. The lights were left on deliberately. The rug remained gone. The house did not tighten as midnight approached. Instead, it remained simply present. At 11:59, a sound came from outside, not footsteps this time, a car door. Poirot's eyes opened. A pause. Then the sound of someone standing still, listening. Poirot spoke softly. "You have lost your classroom," he said. Silence. "You have lost your student," Poirot continued. A breath, barely audible, escaped from outside. Poirot added calmly, "And now you do not know who you are without them." The silence broke. Footsteps moved away, faster this time, uncertain, human. Poirot closed his eyes. "Yes," he murmured. "That is the sound of a lesson ending." Inside, Mrs. Whitcomb slept, not waiting, just sleeping. Poirot sat until dawn. When the sun rose, it filled the hallway without ceremony. The bare wall where the clock had hung caught the light. It looked ordinary, unimportant, which Poirot believed was exactly what it should be. Chapter 8. The Truth That Needed No Words. There are truths that arrive loudly. They burst into rooms, demand attention, insist on explanation. They come with raised voices and sharp gestures, and they leave no space for doubt. And then there are truths that do not need words at all. They arrive quietly, they sit beside you, they wait until you notice them. Hercule Poirot believed that Eleanor Whitcomb's truth belonged to the second kind. The morning after the clock was removed from the hallway, number 12 felt unfamiliar in a way that was neither frightening nor comforting. It simply felt undecided. Sunlight entered the house differently now, falling into the hallway without being measured or announced. The bare wall where the clock had once hung caught the light plainly, without ceremony. There was no tick to shape the moment, no chime to declare authority, just time moving as it wished. Poirot stood in the sitting room, hands folded behind his back, listening. The house made sounds now that it had not made before. A pipe clicked softly as it warmed, floorboards sighed as they adjusted. A distant door down the street closed, without significance. Ordinary sounds. Poirot smiled faintly. This, he thought, was progress. Eleanor Whitcomb came downstairs shortly after 8. She moved more slowly than she had before, but there was less tension in her posture. Her steps were cautious, not because she feared punishment, but because she was learning how to choose where to place her weight. Poirot noticed she did not look toward the bare wall. That mattered. "Good morning, madame," Poirot said gently. She paused, then inclined her head slightly. "Good morning," she replied. The words were quiet, but they were present. Poirot accepted them without comment. They sat together in the sitting room, with tea that steamed gently, untouched for several moments. Poirot did not rush her. He did not ask questions. He understood that the absence of instruction could feel more disorienting than strict control. Eleanor held her cup with both hands, as though grounding herself in its warmth. "You removed the clock," she said at last. "Yes," Poirot replied calmly. She nodded. "It feels strange," she admitted. Poirot smiled softly. "Yes." She considered this. "But not wrong," she added. Poirot's smile deepened just slightly. Inspector Mallory arrived mid-morning. He looked around the hallway instinctively, then frowned when he realized what was missing. "You took it down," he said. Poirot nodded. "For now." Mallory hesitated. "Is that allowed?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The clock," Poirot said gently, "was not evidence. It was influence." Mallory considered that, then nodded slowly. Eleanor watched them both without speaking. Mallory shifted awkwardly. "Mrs. Whitcomb, Poirot raised a hand. "Not yet," he said quietly. Mallory sighed but complied. They sat together in silence for a few moments. Then Eleanor spoke. "I want to tell you something," she said. Mallory leaned forward eagerly. Poirot remained still. She did not look at Mallory. She looked at the space where the clock had been. "When my husband fell," she said, "I did not move." Mallory nodded. "We understand shock." Poirot lifted one finger. "Let her finish," he said softly. Eleanor nodded gratefully. "I did not move," she repeated, "because I was waiting." Mallory swallowed. "Waiting for what?" he asked gently. She exhaled slowly. "For permission," she said. The words settled into the room without weight. Poirot listened. Mallory said nothing. Eleanor continued. "There was always a moment," she said, "after the chime. A moment when I was meant to stand, or speak, or remain where I was." Her fingers tightened briefly around her cup. "I waited for that moment," she said, "even when he collapsed." Mallory's voice was low. "Who taught you that?" She hesitated. Poirot waited. "He did," she said quietly. Mallory frowned. "Your husband?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "He never shouted," she said. "He never struck me. He simply corrected." Poirot nodded gently. "Yes," he said. "Correction is quieter than cruelty." Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by the understanding in his tone. "He would adjust the clock," she said, "only a little, so that I never quite knew if I was early or late." Mallory's jaw tightened. "And when I spoke out of turn," Eleanor continued, "he would wait. He would not respond. He would let the silence remind me." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. This, he thought, was the truth that needed no words. Mallory asked, "And the man in the alley?" Eleanor looked confused. Poirot answered for her. "A student," Poirot said softly. "Someone who admired the lesson." Mallory stared. "You mean Caro learned from Whitcomb?" Poirot nodded. "Some teachers," Poirot said, "do not realize they are teaching." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly. "Julian listened," she said. "He watched. He learned how silence could shape people," Mallory whispered. "And when he died," Eleanor said, "Julian tried to preserve the lesson." Poirot nodded. "He did not want the silence to end," Poirot said, "because without it he had no role." Eleanor sat quietly after that, as though exhausted. Poirot did not press her further. Mallory stood slowly. "That's enough for today," he said gently. Eleanor nodded, relieved. When Mallory stepped outside to make arrangements, Poirot remained seated. Eleanor looked at him. "Will it stop?" she asked quietly. Poirot met her gaze. "Yes," he said, "because it no longer needs to continue." She considered this. "Sometimes," she said, "I still hear it. The pause." Poirot nodded. "That is memory," he said. "It fades when it is not obeyed." She exhaled. Poirot added gently, "And when it returns, you may answer it with anything you like, or nothing at all." She smiled faintly. "I think," she said, "I prefer footsteps." Poirot smiled. That evening Eleanor walked the hallway alone. The bare wall felt odd but not threatening. Her steps echoed lightly. They were uneven, untrained, human. She paused halfway down the hall. then laughed softly at herself. No chime followed. Nothing corrected her. She continued on. Poirot prepared to leave the following morning. Mallory shook his hand at the door. "You ended it without an arrest," Mallory said quietly. Poirot smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "I ended it without noise." Mallory nodded slowly. Poirot turned back to Eleanor. "You will hear echoes," Poirot said gently. "Do not fear them." She nodded. "I won't." Poirot stepped outside. The street greeted him with ordinary sound. Radios, voices, footsteps that meant nothing at all. He paused for a moment, listening. Then he walked on. Inside number 12, Eleanor Whitcomb sat by the window, not waiting, simply watching the day pass. The truth had not arrived with a confession. It had arrived with understanding, and that, Poirot believed, was enough. Chapter 9. The Last Listener. There are people who stop listening when a story ends, and then there are people who cannot. They remain attentive long after the sound has faded, long after the room is emptied, long after the instruction has been withdrawn. They listen not because they are curious, but because listening has become the only way they know how to exist. Hercule Poirot believed Julian Caro belonged to the second kind. The city received Poirot quietly that afternoon. He stepped from the tram and adjusted his coat, blending easily into the flow of pedestrians who moved without rhythm or intention. Shops opened and closed their doors. Radios played different programs at different volumes. Footsteps overlapped without pattern or discipline. To most people, it was noise. To Poirot, it was freedom. He paused near a cafe window where 3 wireless sets were displayed side by side. Each played a different broadcast: music, news, static, creating a soft, unfocused chorus that meant nothing and demanded nothing. Poirot smiled faintly. This, he thought, is what Julian Caro cannot tolerate. Caro sat in the small interview room with the posture of a man waiting for something to begin. The room was deliberately plain: pale walls, a simple table, 2 chairs, a light that neither flickered nor dimmed, no clock, no radio, no metronome. Caro noticed their absence immediately. Poirot entered without haste and sat opposite him. "Good afternoon," Poirot said pleasantly. Caro looked up. "You removed the clock," Caro said. Poirot nodded. "Yes." Caro frowned. "Why?" Poirot folded his hands. "Because," he said gently, "it was telling you who you were." Caro said nothing. Poirot waited. Silence settled between them, not tense, not heavy, simply present. Caro's fingers twitched slightly on the tabletop. Poirot noticed. "You are uncomfortable," Poirot said calmly. Caro's jaw tightened. "I don't like disordered rooms." Poirot nodded. "Yes." Caro leaned forward. "You don't understand," he said. "Silence is structure. Without it, people drift." Poirot smiled faintly. "No," Poirot replied. "Without it, people choose." Caro shook his head. "She needed it," Caro insisted. "She functioned better when she waited." Poirot's eyes remained gentle. "She functioned more quietly," Poirot said. "That is not the same thing." Caro's voice sharpened slightly. "You think you helped her," he said, "but she will still hear it." Poirot nodded. "Yes." Caro's eyes brightened faintly. "Then you failed." Poirot leaned forward just slightly. "No," he said softly, "because now she will decide what to do when she hears it." Caro fell silent. For a long moment, he stared at the empty wall. "There used to be a rhythm," he said quietly. "A certainty," Poirot nodded. "Yes," he said, "and you mistook it for meaning." Caro's fingers tightened. "When the chime came," Caro said, "everything made sense." Poirot listened. "And when it didn't?" Poirot asked gently. Caro swallowed. "I waited," he said. Poirot nodded. "And when no one came?" Poirot continued. Caro's voice dropped. "I listened harder." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "That," he said softly, "is the danger of control." Outside the interview room, Inspector Mallory waited quietly. He could hear nothing of the conversation, only the steady hum of the building around him. He found himself counting his own breaths without realizing it. Inside, Poirot stood. "You were not born this way," Poirot said gently to Caro. "Someone taught you." Caro looked up sharply. Poirot continued. You learned that silence was reward, Poirot said. That being unseen was power. Caro's gaze flickered. My father, he said suddenly. Poirot nodded. He listened, Caro said. Always. He said noise meant weakness. Poirot's voice softened. And you believed him. Caro said nothing. Poirot left without drama. There was no confession to extract, no outburst to provoke. The truth had already arrived quietly, in the way it always did, when allowed time. Caro remained seated long after Poirot departed. He listened, but there was nothing left to hear. That evening, Eleanor Whitcomb sat in her sitting room with the window open. The street below was alive with ordinary sound, laughter, footsteps, a distant radio fading in and out of tune. None of it demanded her attention. She closed her eyes and breathed. For a moment she thought she heard the pause, the familiar space between moments. But this time she did not wait. She stood, she walked. Her footsteps sounded clear and uneven against the wooden floor. She smiled. Later, Eleanor turned on the radio, not the modified, but the ordinary set she had kept covered for years. Music filled the room, not too loud, not too quiet. She adjusted it until it pleased her. Then she left it playing as she moved about the house. Hercule Poirot walked through the city as night settled. The lamps came on one by one, doors closed. The world prepared itself for rest, not by command, but by habit. Poirot paused at a street corner and listened. There was no rhythm to follow, no instruction to obey, only life continuing. He smiled faintly. Back in the interview room, Julie and Caro sat alone. No chime came, no signal followed. No one corrected the silence. For the first time, he was not a listener. He was simply a man in a quiet room, and the quiet did not answer him. Chapter 10. After the case was closed, there is a moment, after a story ends, when the mind still listens, not because it expects more, but because it has not yet accepted that nothing else is required. The final chime has sounded. The footsteps have faded. The room has returned to ordinary air, and yet for a little while something inside us stays alert, like a hand hovering near a lamp switch in a darkened hallway. Hercule Poirot understood this moment well. He had closed many cases, he had watched many endings, and he had learned that the true conclusion did not occur when the culprit was named, or when the evidence was gathered, or even when the witness finally spoke. The true conclusion occurred when the world stopped asking to be obeyed. Morning arrived gently at number 12. The sunlight did not burst through the windows. It slipped in quietly, as though careful not to disturb the peace the house had finally earned. The sitting room, once trained to hold its breath, now simply existed. Furniture stood where it stood, not like a performance, but like a home. Eleanor Whitcomb came downstairs with a softness to her steps that was new. She did not pause at the hallway wall where the clock had once hung. She did not turn, her head as though waiting for instruction. She walked straight into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and turned on the flame. The ordinary sound of water meeting metal filled the room. It was small, but to Eleanor it felt immense. Edwin Mallory, Inspector Mallory, as she still thought of him, had called earlier to say that the paperwork would take time, but the worst was over. There would be questions, but they would be handled gently. There would be official words, but they would not be thrown at her like stones. Eleanor had thanked him. The words still felt strange in her mouth, but they did not hurt. Poirot sat at the kitchen table as she worked. He did not offer advice. He simply watched her re-enter her own life. When the kettle began to sing, Eleanor reached for cups. Two, not because she was instructed to provide for a guest, but because she wanted to. Poirot accepted his tea with a small nod. They drank in silence for a while, but this silence was different. It was not commanded, not instructed, not measured. It belonged to them. At last, Eleanor spoke quietly. "I thought it would feel louder," she said. Poirot looked at her. "What?" "Freedom," she replied. Poirot smiled faintly. "Freedom," he said gently, "is often quieter than fear." Eleanor nodded slowly. She stared at the steam rising from her cup. "I keep waiting for a consequence," she admitted, "for something to correct me." Poirot nodded. "Yes," he said, "that is the last habit to leave." Eleanor's voice softened. "And does it?" she asked. "Leave?" Poirot met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "when you stop feeding it." Later that day, Poirot walked through the sitting room alone. The lamp was off. Daylight was enough. The chair by the window remained, but it no longer looked like a station. It looked like a place to sit and watch the world pass. Poirot opened the curtains fully. Sunlight fell across the floorboards. Dust motes drifted in the beam, slow and lazy. The house, he thought, was learning again. He paused at the bare wall in the hallway. The absence of the clock was still noticeable, but absence could become ordinary too. Eleanor appeared behind him quietly. "I thought you'd put it back," she said. Poirot glanced at her gently. "One day," he replied, "when it becomes just a clock again." Eleanor nodded. Poirot turned and smiled faintly. "For now," he said, "this wall is teaching you something." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "What?" Poirot's voice was soft. "That nothing has to command you," he said. That evening, Inspector Mallory arrived to escort Poirot to the station, not because Poirot needed escort, but because Mallory felt a certain respect for endings. And he wanted to speak to Poirot once more without the urgency of investigation pressing them forward. They stood at the door of number 12 while the sun sank behind the rooftops. Mallory shifted his weight. "So," he said, "it's finished." Poirot nodded. "Yes," Mallory frowned. "But I keep thinking," Mallory admitted, "we never had the kind of ending people expect." Poirot smiled faintly. "You mean," he said, "no dramatic confession?" Mallory nodded. "No courtroom performance," Poirot continued. "No shouting." Mallory exhaled. "Yes," he admitted. Poirot looked at him with gentle amusement. "Inspector," Poirot said, "some crimes are loud. They end loudly. But this crime was quiet," Mallory finished. Poirot nodded. "Then it must end quietly too," he said. Mallory glanced toward the hallway inside, where the bare wall caught a last strip of orange light. "And Julian Caro?" Mallory asked. Poirot's expression softened. "He will sit in silence," Poirot said. "And he will discover that silence is not a friend, it is only space." Mallory nodded slowly. "And Eleanor?" he asked. Poirot glanced back into the house. "She will learn," Poirot said, "that space can belong to her." On the way to the station, Poirot walked calmly beside Mallory. The street was alive with ordinary sound. A radio played from an open window, music drifting out lazily. Two neighbors spoke in low voices, their conversation incomplete but warm. Footsteps passed without significance. Mallory glanced at Poirot. "You really think she'll be all right?" he asked quietly. Poirot nodded. "She will be," Poirot said, "because the case did not require her to become brave." Mallory frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot smiled faintly. "It only required her," he said, "to stop obeying." Mallory considered that for a long moment. Then he nodded. That night, in the holding facility, Julian Caro lay awake. No clock ticked in his room. No metronome waited to tell him what came next. The light was dim, the air was still, the walls were plain. Caro listened. His body waited for a signal that did not arrive. At first he felt anger, then frustration, then something colder and quieter. He realized he did not know where to place himself in time, because for years he had been placing himself according to cues he created. He had believed control was safety. Now, without control, he felt exposed to the ordinary disorder of existence. And the disorder did not care about him. It did not correct him. It did not punish him. It did not reward him. It simply continued. Caro closed his eyes, and for the first time he was forced to meet silence as it truly was. Not command, just quiet. Back at number 12, Eleanor sat in her sitting room with the window slightly open. The evening air drifted in, carrying the soft, layered sound of the street. A distant radio, a door closing, a voice laughing briefly, then fading. Eleanor listened. For a moment she felt the old pause return, like a shadow of habit. The space between sounds, the feeling that something was supposed to happen next. She inhaled. Then she stood deliberately. She walked across the floor and turned on the lamp. Light filled the sitting room gently, not as defense, as choice. She smiled faintly at herself. Then she walked to the chair by the window and sat down. She watched the street lamps glow. She listened to ordinary life, and the silence did not ask anything of her. In the early hours of the morning, Poirot sat in a quiet station lounge, waiting for his train. A wireless set in the corner played softly. News, then music, then a brief crackle of static. Poirot listened with half-closed eyes, not for clues, not for patterns, just for the comfort of sound that meant nothing. The train arrived. Poirot boarded. As it pulled away, the city receded into distance, taking with it the case of the silent witness. The story was over, the final chime had sounded, and nothing, at last, needed permission to continue. Soft sleep, sign off. Thank you for listening. If you're drifting off, rest well. If you're still awake, may the quiet feel gentle, not commanding. This has been Hercule Mysteries. And this was the case of the silent witness. End broadcast.